The American Revolutionary War, 1775–1783, also known as the American War of Independence, was an 18th century war between the Kingdom of Great Britain and the 13 colonies allied with France that declared independence, giving birth to the United States of America. After 1765, deepening ideological and political differences strained relations between Great Britain and its colonies. Patriot protests against taxation without representation under the Stamp Act escalated into boycotts of British goods, culminating in 1773 with the destruction of a cargo of tea in Boston Harbor by the Sons of Liberty. Britain responded by closing Boston Harbor and passing a series of punitive measures against the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The people of Massachusetts issued the Suffolk Resolutions and established a secret government to wrest control of the countryside from the British Crown. The 12 colonies formed the Continental Congress to coordinate resistance, creating committees and conventions that effectively seized power. British attempts to disarm the Massachusetts militia at Concord led to open fighting on April 19, 1775. The militia then besieged Boston, forcing the British to evacuate in March 1776, and Congress appointed George Washington to command the Continental Army. At the same time, the Americans failed in their attempt to invade Quebec and spread the rebellion against the British. On July 7, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted for independence, issuing a declaration on July 4th. Sir William Howe led a British counterattack, recapturing New York and breaking American resolve. However, victories at Trenton and Princeton restored American confidence. In 1777, the British launched an invasion from Quebec led by General John Burgoyne, with the intention of isolating the New England colonies. Instead of supporting this effort, Howe led his army on a separate campaign against Philadelphia, and Burgoyne was utterly defeated at the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. Burgoyne's defeat had significant consequences. France formally allied with the Americans and entered the war in 1778, and Spain joined as an ally of France, but not of the United States the following year. In 1780, the Kingdom of Mysore attacked the British in India, and tensions between Britain and the Netherlands erupted into full-scale war. In North America, the British implemented a Southern strategy led by Charles Cornwallis, where there was a pro-royalist loyalist uprising, but only a small number of men volunteered. Cornwallis was counterattacked at the Battle of Kings Mountain and the Battle of Cowpens. He was forced to retreat to Yorktown, Virginia, with plans to evacuate, but a decisive French naval victory prevented his escape. The Franco-American coalition, led by the Comte de Rochambeau and Washington, then surrounded Cornwallis' army, and with no sign of relief, Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. The British Whigs had long opposed the pro-war Tories in Parliament, and this surrender gave them the upper hand. In early 1782, Parliament voted to end all military action in America, but the war continued overseas. Britain remained besieged at Gibraltar, but had won a resounding victory over the French Navy. On September 3, 1783, the belligerents signed the Treaty of Paris, in which Great Britain agreed to recognize American sovereignty and formally end the war. France's entry into the war was decisive, 45, but France gained little from the war and was heavily indebted. Spain made some territorial gains but failed in its main goal of recovering Gibraltar. The Dutch were defeated on all fronts and were forced to cede territory to Great Britain. In India, the war against Mysore and its allies ended in 1784 with the Treaty of Mangalore, without any territorial changes. Reason since 1763, after the 7 Years' War, Britain became a large colonial empire, controlling many colonies, but because the British needed to pay for the French Indian War, 1756-1763. To do that, the British government had to impose a large amount of taxes on the 13 colonies in North America. At this time, the colonies had a tradition of self-government after the British colonists forgot them to focus on solving domestic unrest such as the Civil War. The Americans strongly opposed because they believed that Britain did not represent Parliament and therefore had no right to do so. The British king had to withdraw the taxes. However, the British colonists left behind the tea tax in 1773 in the port of Boston, Massachusetts. When a ship carrying tea passed by, 3 groups of 50 Americans threw tea onto the deck, also known as the Boston Tea Party event. This was the colonial opposition to the tea tax, giving birth to ideas about the future independence of the United States. The outbreak of revolution was a sure thing to happen. Development War breaks out, 1775-1776. Main articles: Battles of Lexington and Concord, Boston campaigned, Invasion of Quebec, 1775. Southern Theater of the American Revolutionary War, and Battle of Nassau, major campaigns of the American Revolutionary War. On April 18, 1775, 700 British troops were sent to confiscate the militia's arsenal stored at Concord. Fighting broke out, forcing the army to retreat to Boston. That night, local militiamen laid siege to Boston. On May 25th, 4,500 British reinforcements arrived, led by Generals William Howe, John Burgoyne, and Henry Clinton. The British captured the Charlestown Peninsula on June 17th after a costly frontal assault, which resulted in General Gage being replaced by Howe. Many senior officers were demoralized by the attack, and General Gage wrote to London urging a larger army to quell the rebellion. On July 3rd, George Washington took command of the Continental Army besieging Boston. Howe did not counterattack, surprising Washington. A plan to attack the city was rejected, and instead the Americans placed heavy artillery on Dorchester Peak. In early March 1776, captured from a raid on Fort Ticonderoga, the British were allowed to withdraw unmolested on March 17th and sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Washington then moved the army to New York. Beginning in August 1775, American ships began raiding villages near Nova Scotia, starting at St. John, then Charlottetown, and Yarmouth. This continued in 1776 at Canso, and then an overland attack. On Fort Cumberland, British Army marches to Concord. Meanwhile, British officials in Quebec began lobbying the Indian tribes for support, while the Americans urged them to remain neutral. In April 1775, Parliament feared a British and Indigenous attack from Canada and ordered an invasion of Quebec. Quebec had a predominantly French-speaking population and had been under British rule for only 12 years. And the Americans thought they would be welcomed there as liberators of Canada from British rule. The Americans attacked Quebec City on December 31st after an arduous march, but were defeated. After a loose siege, the Americans withdrew on May 6, 1776. A failed counterattack on June 8th ended American operations in Quebec. However, the British were unable to mount a pursuit by American ships on Lake Champlain. On October 11th, the British defeated the American forces, forcing them to retreat to Ticonderoga and ending the campaign. The invasion discredited the Patriots in the eyes of British public opinion, while violent anti-loyalist policies deprived the Americans of support from Canada. The Patriots continued to view Quebec as a strategic target, although no further attempts at invasion were made. British soldiers and local militia resist an American raid at Sault au Matelot, Canada, December 17, Papadiafe-Fiore. In Virginia, Royal Governor the Marquis of Dunmore disarmed the militia as tensions escalated, although no fighting broke out. He issued a proclamation on November 7, 1775, promising freedom to slaves who fled from Patriot masters to fight for the crown. Dunmore's army was overwhelmed by Patriots at Great Bridge. Dunmore escaped to naval vessels anchored off Norfolk. Negotiations then broke down, leading Dunmore to order warships to destroy the town. Fighting broke out on November 19th in South Carolina between Loyalist and Patriot militias, and the Loyalists were subsequently driven from the colony. Loyalists were recruited in North Carolina to reassert colonial rule in the South, but suffered a decisive defeat, and Loyalist ideology was subdued. A British army planned to retake South Carolina and launched an attack on Charleston on June 28, 1776, but it failed, leaving the South under Patriot control until 1780. Gunpowder shortages prompted Congress to organize an expedition to the British West Indies colony of the Bahamas to secure supplies there. On March 3, 1776, the Americans won, a bloodless victory due to the lack of resistance from the local militia. They took all the barrels of gunpowder they could load and departed on March 17th. The fleet arrived at New London, Connecticut on April 8th after a brief skirmish with the Royal Navy frigate HMS Glasgow on April 6th. British counteroffensive, American soldiers fighting at the Battle of Long Island, 1776, after regrouping at Halifax. General William Howe resolved to defeat the Americans. He left the port in June 1776 and landed on Staten Island near the entrance to New York Harbor on July 2nd. Due to poor military intelligence, Washington deployed his army to positions on Manhattan Island and across the East River to western Long Island, and peace negotiations offered by the British were rejected by the Americans. On August 27th, Howe outflanked Washington's army and forced him to retreat to Brooklyn Peak. Howe did not allow his subordinates to pursue him, choosing instead to surround Washington. Washington withdrew to Manhattan without any loss of men or equipment. After the retreat, the Staten Island Peace Conference failed to reach a peace treaty because the British delegates did not have the authority to recognize independence. Howe then took control of New York City on September 15th and unsuccessfully fought a battle with the Americans the following day. He attempted to surround Washington's army, but the Americans successfully fled. On October 28th, the British fought indecisively against Washington, with Howe refusing to attack Washington's army, instead concentrating his forces on a hill of no strategic value, British warships on the Hudson River. Washington's withdrawal left his forces isolated, and the British captured an American fort on November 16th, taking 3,000 prisoners in what one historian called the most disastrous defeat of the entire war. Washington's army withdrew 4 days later. Henry Clinton then captured Newport, Rhode Island, an operation he opposed, feeling that the 6,000 troops assigned to him could be better used to pursue Washington. The American prisoners were then sent to the notorious prison boats, in which more American soldiers and sailors died of disease than were killed on the battlefields of the war. Charles Cornwallis pursued Washington, but Howe ordered him to stop, and Washington escaped without suffering any casualties. Overall, the American Revolution was in a bleak state. The army had dwindled to less than 5,000 men and would shrink further when the draft expired at the end of the year. Popular support wavered, the spirit of resistance waned, and Congress had to leave Philadelphia. Loyalist movements surged after the American defeat, especially in New York. Emanuel Leutze's 1851 painting illustrating Washington's crossing of the Delaware River, news of the campaign, was well received in Britain. Celebrations took place. In London, public support was high, and the king awarded William Howe the Order of the Bath. These successes reinforced British confidence that they could win within a year. The American defeat was attributed by one writer to Washington's strategic shortcomings, his division of an army vastly outnumbered against a clearly superior enemy, his inexperienced officers misunderstanding the situation, and his undisciplined troops fleeing in disarray when the fighting began. Meanwhile, the British were stationed in winter quarters and were in perfect position to continue the campaign. On December 25, 1776, Washington stealthily crossed the Delaware River, and his army overwhelmed the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey the following morning, taking 900 prisoners. This decisive victory boosted the morale of the army and gave new hope to the cause of independence. Cornwallis marched back to retake Trenton, but his efforts were repulsed on January 2nd. Washington outmaneuvered Cornwallis that evening and defeated his rearguard the following day. These successive victories convinced the French and Spanish that America was a worthy ally, as well as restoring morale in the army. Washington encamped in eastern quarters at Morristown, New Jersey on January 6th, although guerrilla fighting continued. During the siege, Howe made no attempt to attack, much to Washington's surprise. Failure of the British Northern Campaign, 1777 to 1778. In December 1776, John Burgoyne returned to London to discuss strategy with Marquis Georges Germain. Burgoyne's plan was to establish control of the Champlain-George Hudson route from New York to Quebec, isolating New England. Subsequent efforts would likely focus on attacking the southern colonies, where they believed the people still supported the Crown. Surrender at Saratoga shows General Daniel Morgan in front of a de Valliere 4-pounder. Burgoyne's plan was to lead one army along Lake Champlain, while a strategic decoy advanced along the Mohawk River, and the two would meet. At Albany, Burgoyne set out on June 14, 1707, quickly capturing Ticonderoga on July 5th. Leaving 1,300 men behind as a garrison, Burgoyne continued his advance. Progress was slow. The Americans blocked the road, destroyed bridges, blocked streams, and destroyed food supplies. Meanwhile, Barry St. Leger's diversionary force besieged Fort Stanwix. St. Leger withdrew to Quebec on August 22nd after the supporting natives abandoned him. On August 16th, a Hessian expedition was defeated at Bennington and over 700 soldiers were captured. Meanwhile, most of Burgoyne's native reinforcements had abandoned him, and Howe informed Burgoyne that he would begin his campaign in Philadelphia as planned and would not be able to come to his aid. Burgoyne decided to continue the attack. On September 19th, he attempted to flank the Americans, and they met at Freeman's Farm. The British were victorious, but at a cost of 600 casualties. Burgoyne then erected fortifications, but his forces were being depleted by deserters, and vital supplies were running low. On October 7th, British scouts attacked the American lines and were repulsed with heavy losses. Burgoyne then abandoned his position, and the Americans pursued them closely, and by October 13th, his men were surrounded. With no hope of relief and supplies running low, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17th, and 6 British soldiers became prisoners. This success prompted France to enter the war as an ally of the United States, securing the final elements necessary for victory over British colonialism, namely foreign support. Washington and Lafayette at Valley Forge. Meanwhile, Howe began a campaign against Washington, although his initial efforts in June 1777 failed. Howe refused to attack Philadelphia by land through New Jersey or by sea through Delaware Bay, although both options would have allowed him to support Burgoyne if necessary. Instead, he took the time-consuming route through the Chesapeake Bay, and leaving him unable to support Burgoyne. This decision was controversial, with many criticizing Howe and accusing him of treason. Howe outflanked and defeated Washington's army on September 11th, but he was unable to use the momentum of his victory to destroy the Americans. The British victory at Willistown left Philadelphia defenseless, and Howe captured the city unopposed on September 26th. Howe then transferred 9,000 troops to Germantown, north of Philadelphia. Washington led a surprise attack on Howe's garrison on October 4th, but was repulsed. Once again, Howe did not follow up on his victory, leaving the American army intact and able to fight. After several days of probing the American defenses at White Marsh, Howe inexplicably ordered a retreat to Philadelphia. Howe ignored the vulnerable American rear, where an attack could deprive Washington of supplies. On December 19th, Washington's army entered winter quarters at Valley Forge. Poor weather conditions and food problems resulted in the deaths of some 2,500 men. Howe, only 20 miles, 32 kilometers from the Americans, did not attack, and later critics have suggested that if the attack had been realistic, it might have ended the war. The Continental Army was put on a new training program supervised by Baron von Steuben, which introduced the most modern Prussian methods of warfare. Meanwhile, Howe resigned and was replaced by Henry Clinton on May 24, 1778. Clinton received orders to leave Philadelphia and reinforce New York after France entered the war. On June 18th, the British abandoned Philadelphia, with the upgraded Americans in pursuit. 149. The two armies fought at Monmouth Courthouse on June 28th, with the Americans occupying the field, greatly boosting American morale and confidence. By July, both armies had returned to their previous status of 2 years foreign intervention. The defeat at Saratoga made Britain nervous about foreign intervention. Secretary North sought to reconcile with the colonies by agreeing to their original terms, although the Marquis of North refused to grant them independence. No positive response was received from the Americans. French soldiers sweep through Redoubt. 9 during the siege of Yorktown. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, was anti-British and sought a pretext to go to war with Britain after the conquest of Canada in 1763. The French had been secretly supplying the Americans through neutral Dutch ports since the war began, which had been invaluable during the Saratoga campaign. The French public supported the war, although Vergennes and King Louis XVI were hesitant due to the high military and financial risks. The American victory at Saratoga convinced the French that the Patriots were trustworthy allies, but doing so also carried certain risks. The king feared that British concessions would be granted, and then Britain would reconcile with the colonies to attack French and Spanish territory in the Caribbean. To prevent this, France formally recognized the United States on February 6, 1778, and followed with a military alliance. France aimed to expel Britain from the Newfoundland fishing grounds, end restrictions on the sovereignty of Dunkirk, regain free trade routes in India, recover Senegal and Dominica, and to restore the terms of the Treaty of Utrecht regarding Anglo-French trade. Spain avoided provoking war with Britain before it was ready and supplied the Patriots through its colonies in New Spain. Congress hoped to persuade Spain to join an open alliance, so the First American Committee met with the Count of Aranda in 1776. Spain remained reluctant to make an early commitment, due to the lack of direct French involvement, the threat to its treasure fleet, and the possibility of war with Portugal, Spain's neighbor and close ally of Britain. However, Spain affirmed its desire to support the Americans the following year, hoping to weaken the British Empire. The Portuguese threat was neutralized in the Portuguese-Spanish War, 1776-77. Britain had taken all necessary steps to avoid it, and cited Britain's victories over France in the 7 Years' War as a reason to remain optimistic. Britain tried in vain to find an ally powerful enough to fight France together, which would isolate her, prevent Britain from concentrating its forces on one front, and force Britain to spread its forces thin in America. However, the king was adamant that he would not recognize American independence and would ravage the colonies indefinitely, or until they begged to return to the Crown's rule. Alfred Thayer Mahan argued that the British effort to fight on multiple fronts at once without allies was fundamentally flawed, as the forces could not support each other, leaving them defeated in small battles. Since the outbreak of the conflict, Britain had urged its ally, the Dutch Republic, to remain neutral and lease the Scots Brigade to England for service in America. But the pro-American sentiments of the Dutch community forced them to refuse this request. The British attempted to invoke several treaties to obtain military assistance from the Netherlands, but they were refused. Furthermore, the American army was supplied with weapons by Dutch merchants through the West Indies colonies. Supplies from France to America also passed through Dutch ports. The Republic maintained free trade with France even after the latter declared war on Britain, citing Britain's earlier concessions on the matter. Britain responded by confiscating Dutch maritime goods and even firing on their ships. The Republic thus joined the First League of Armed Neutrality to demonstrate its neutrality. The Republic also respected American privateers and even entered into trade agreements with the Americans. Britain declared these actions against the Republic's neutrality and declared war in December 1780. International war breaks out 1778, 1780 Maine. Articles: France in the American Revolutionary War, Anglo-French War 1778-1783, Spain in the American Revolutionary War, Second Anglo-Mysore War, and Fourth Anglo-Dutch War Europe Battle of Cape Saint. Vincent Moonlight, January 16, 1780 by Francis Holman, painted in 1780, immediately after the French declaration of war. The French and British fleets fought an inconclusive battle off Ushant on 27 July 1778. Spain entered the war on 12 April 1779. With the primary objective of capturing Gibraltar, the Spanish army under the Duc de Crillon laid siege to the Mount of Gibraltar on 24th of June. However, the naval blockade was relatively weak, and the British were able to slip through and resupply the garrison. Meanwhile, plans for a Franco-Spanish invasion of Britain were drawn up, but the expedition failed due to poor coordination, disease, logistical problems, and high financial costs. However, the Franco-American Diversionary Force achieved some success on 23 September, led by John Paul Jones. On 16 January 1780, the Royal Navy commanded by George Rodney won a major victory over Spain, weakening the naval blockade of Gibraltar. A Franco-Spanish fleet commanded by Luis de Cordova intercepted a large British convoy off the Azores, led by John Moultrie on 9 August, which was heading for the West Indies. The defeat was catastrophic for the British, who lost 52 merchant ships, 5 East India ships, 80,000 muskets, 40,000 men, 294 cannons, and 3,144 soldiers. The defeat cost an estimated $100, $5 million, equivalent to $181 million in today's money, dealing a heavy blow to British trade. America, the French blockaded the islands with lucrative sugar deposits, Barbados and Jamaica, with the intention of damaging British trade. A French army led by the Marquis de Bouillé captured Dominica on 7 September 1778 to improve communications between the French Caribbean islands and combat piracy. 1G. The British defeated a French naval force on 15 December and captured St. Lucia on 28 December. Both fleets received reinforcements during the first half of 1779. But the French, led by the Comte d'Estaing, had the upper hand in the Caribbean and began to seize British territories, taking St. Lucia and St. Lucia on 28 December, Vincent on 18 June, and Grenada on 4 July. John Byron's British fleet was tactically defeated on 6 July by pursuing d'Estaing from Grenada, 208, the worst loss suffered by the Royal Navy since 1690, navally. Engagements continued until 17th April 1780, when the British and French fleets clashed off Martinique. General Bernardo de Galvez raised an army at New Orleans and drove the British out of the Gulf of Mexico. He captured 5 British forts in the lower Mississippi Valley, and they repelled a British and Indian attack at St. Louis, Missouri, and overran the British Fort St. Joseph in Niles, Michigan. He received reinforcements from Cuba, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, and then captured Mobile and Pensacola, the capital of the British colony of West Florida. At Pensacola, Galvez commanded a multinational army of over 7,000 black soldiers born in Spain, Cuba, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Santo Domingo, and other Spanish colonies such as Venezuela. In Central America, spending on the defense of Guatemala was Spain's top priority. The British intended to capture the key fortress of San Fernando de Omoa and kick the Spanish out of the region. After initial unsuccessful attempts, 1,200 British troops led by William Dalrymple arrived on October 16th and captured the fort on October 20th. However, the British troops were largely sick and were forced to abandon the fort on November 29th, and Spanish troops later recaptured it. In 1780, the governor of Jamaica, John Dowling, planned an expedition to divide the two New Spains by capturing Grenada, which would give them complete control of the San Juan River. A British expedition was deployed on February 3, 1780, led by John Arlington and Horatio Nelson. They reached Fort San Juan on March 17th, stormed the citadel, and captured it on April 29th. The British were again defeated by disease and were short of food due to poor logistics. They withdrew on November 8th, the expedition having suffered a decisive defeat. They withdrew on November 8th, the expedition having suffered a decisive defeat. Some 2,500 soldiers were killed, making it the costliest British disaster of the war. India. The army of the Kingdom of Mysore defeated the British at Polilur, using rockets to bombard closely packed infantry. The British East India Company quickly seized French colonies in India when they learned of the hostilities with France, and captured Pondicherry on 19 October 1778 after a 2-week siege. The company was determined to drive the French out of India completely, and captured the Malabar port of Mahe in 1779, through which French arms shipments passed. Mahe was under the protection of the Mysore ruler Hyder Ali, the Tipu Sultan, and tensions began when the British supported the Malabar rebels who rose up against him. Hyder Ali invaded the Carnatic in July 1780 and laid siege to Telrikri and Arcot. A relief force of 7,000 British troops under William Byell was intercepted and destroyed by Tipu Sultan on 10 September, the worst defeat of a European army in India at that time. Ali then renewed the siege at Arcot instead of continuing the pressure, and the result was a decisive victory over the 2nd British Army at Madras, which they captured on 3 November. The delay, however, allowed the British to regroup for further resistance the following year. Stalemate in the north, 1778-1780. Give 'em Watts, boys! American soldiers repel Wilhelm von Knyphausen's attack at Springfield. Henry Clinton withdrew from Philadelphia, consolidating his forces in New York after the British defeat at Saratoga and the entry of France into the war. The French admiral Comte d'Estaing was sent to North America in April 1778 to assist Washington, and he arrived shortly after Clinton withdrew to New York. The Franco-American forces felt that New York's defenses were too formidable for the French fleet, and they chose to attack Newport. This attempt was launched on August 29th, but ultimately failed when the French withdrew their troops, much to the Americans' displeasure. The war then descended into a stalemate, with most of the fighting being small raids, such as at Chestnut Neck and Little Harbor. In the summer of 1779, the Americans captured the British positions at Stony Point and Paulus Hook. In July, Clinton unsuccessfully attempted to assist Washington in a decisive battle by launching a major raid on Connecticut. That same month, a major American naval operation attempted to retake Maine, but resulted in the worst naval defeat in American history until Pearl Harbor in 1941. The high frequency of Iroquois attacks on the local population prompted Washington to launch a punitive expedition that destroyed a large number of Iroquois settlements, but ultimately failed to stop further guerrilla attacks. During the winter of 1779-80, the Continental Army suffered further hardship at Valley Forge. Morale was low, popular support had been eroded by the long war. The national currency was virtually worthless. The army was worried about supplies. Desertion became common, and several infantry regiments mutinied in this state as early as 1780. Hamilton surrenders at Vincennes, February 29, 1779. In 1780, Clinton launched a reconquest of New Jersey. On June 7th, 6,000 troops began an invasion under the Hessian general Wilhelm von Knyphausen, but they encountered fierce resistance from local militia. The British still held the area, but Knyphausen, fearing a direct engagement with Washington's main army, withdrew. Knyphausen and Clinton made a second reconquest 2 weeks later, but were soundly defeated at Springfield, ending British ambitions in New Jersey. Meanwhile, American General Benedict Arnold defected and joined the British, plotting to surrender the key American fortress at West Point to the enemy. The plot was exposed when British spy master John Andre was captured, so ours. The British side in New York. He attempted to justify his treason by appealing to loyalist public opinion, but the Patriots condemned him as a coward and traitor. The war west of the Appalachians was largely limited to small skirmishes and raids. A militia expedition was delayed by bad weather in February 17 PTT, its mission being to destroy British supplies in settlements along the Cuyahoga River. Later that year, a second campaign was launched to seize the Illinois country from the British. The Americans captured Kaskaskia on July 4th and then pacified Vincennes, although Vincennes was retaken by Henry Hamilton, the British commander at Detroit. In early 1779, the Americans counterattacked with a surprise winter march. The British surrendered at Vincennes, and they also captured Hamilton. On May 25, 1780, the British launched an expedition into Kentucky as part of a plan to clear the rebels from Quebec to the Gulf Coast. The expedition was not very successful, and hundreds of settlers were killed or captured. The Americans responded with a large-scale offensive along the Mad River in August, which achieved some success, but did not reduce native attacks on the frontier. French militia attempted to capture Detroit, but it ended in disaster when Miami Indians ambushed and defeated the assembled army on November 5th. The war in the West became a stalemate. The Americans did not have the manpower to simultaneously defeat hostile Indian tribes and seize their land. War in the South, 1778-1781. British soldiers besieging Charleston in 1780. By Alonzo Chappell, the British turned their attention to the South in 1778 after the Loyalists in London secured them a strong military base there. The Southern campaign also had the advantage of allowing the Royal Navy to sail into the Caribbean, if necessary, to protect the strategic colonies from the Franco-Spanish fleet. On December 29, 1778, an expeditionary corps from New York captured Savannah, then moved inland to recruit more troops. They achieved promising results in early 1779, but soon a Loyalist army was defeated at the Battle of Kellow Creek on February 14th, and they realized their dependence on the British. However, the British defeated Patriot militia forces at the Battle of Briar Creek on March 3rd, and then conducted a sweep of Charleston, South Carolina. The campaign became notorious for the high level of looting by the British, which outraged both Loyalists and Patriots. In October, a Franco-American campaign to recapture Savannah failed. In May 1780, Henry Clinton captured Charleston, taking 5,000 prisoners and destroying most of the Continental Army in the South. The American resistance in the South collapsed when Banastre Tarleton defeated the fleeing Americans at Waxhaws. On Suir, May 29th Congress appointed Horatio Gates, the victor at Saratoga, to lead the rebels in the South. He suffered a major defeat at Camden on August 16, 1780, setting the stage for Cornwallis's invasion of North Carolina. The British attempted to pacify the countryside, but the Patriot militia remained stubbornly resistant, so Cornwallis sent troops to recruit Loyalists to reinforce his left flank while he marched north. Cornwallis's left flank was nearly breached on October 7th, preventing Loyalist support in the Carolinas. Cornwallis then called off his advance and withdrew to South Carolina. Washington temporarily replaced Gates with his trusted subordinate, Nathanael Greene. Greene could not face the British directly, so he sent a force under Daniel Morgan to get more troops. Morgan then defeated the British Legion under Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton on January 17, 1781, at Cowpens. Cornwallis was criticized for leaving a large portion of his army unsupported, but the British advanced into North Carolina despite the defeat, believing they would have Loyalist support there. Greene did not want to fight Cornwallis head-on, instead adopting a strategy of attrition to slowly wear down Cornwallis's army. By March, Greene's army was strong enough to match Cornwallis's. The two armies met at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th. Greene was defeated, but Cornwallis's army suffered huge casualties. Furthermore, far fewer Loyalists participated in the battle than the British had expected. Cornwallis's casualties were so great that he was forced to retreat to Wilmington for reinforcements, and the Patriots retained control of the interior, of the Carolinas and Georgia. Greene then recaptured the South. The Americans suffered a major setback at Hobkirk's Hill on April 25th. However, they continued to overrun strategic British positions in the area, capturing Fort Watson and Fort Mott. Augusta was the last major British outpost in the South outside of Charleston and Savannah, which the Americans captured on June 6. A British force clashed with the Americans at Eutaw Springs on September 8th in a last-ditch effort to stop Greene, but the British suffered heavy losses and fled to Charleston. Minor skirmishes continued in the Carolinas until the end of the war, and the British were pinned down in Charleston and Savannah for the remainder of the war. British defeat in America, 1781. Main article, Yorktown Campaign French, left, and British, right. Navies exchange artillery fire at the Battle of the Chesapeake. Cornwallis discovered that most of the American supplies in the Carolinas had to pass through Virginia, and he wrote to Marquis Germain and Clinton discussing the plan of action. Cornwallis believed that a successful campaign there would weaken Greene and cause the American resistance in the South to collapse. Clinton strongly opposed the plan, favoring a campaign further north in the Chesapeake Bay. Marquis Germain approved Cornwallis's plan and ignored Clinton's decision. Although Clinton was Cornwallis's superior, Cornwallis advanced into Virginia without informing Clinton. Notably, General Clinton failed to present a coherent strategy to the British in 1781 due to his difficult relationship with his naval counterpart, Americot Arbuthnot. After the disastrous campaigns at Newport and Savannah, French military leaders realized that closer cooperation with the Americans was necessary to achieve success. The French fleet under the Comte de Grasse had received discretionary orders from Paris to support joint operations in the north if naval support was needed. Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau discussed options for attack. Washington wanted to attack New York, while Rochambeau wanted to take Virginia, where the British lines were less strong and therefore more vulnerable. The Franco-American movements around New York greatly worried Clinton, who was wary of a raid on the city. Clinton's instructions to Cornwallis during this time were vague, rarely clear. Clinton sent instructions to Cornwallis to establish a fortified naval base and move troops north to defend New York. Cornwallis established a fort at Yorktown and awaited the Royal Navy. The surrender of Cornwallis at Yorktown by John Trumbull, 1797. Washington still favored an attack on New York, but he approved the French plan when they sent their naval fleet to the chosen target of Yorktown. In August, the Franco-Americans joined forces and moved south to join de Grasse in confronting Cornwallis. The British lacked the naval resources to effectively counter the French, but they sent a fleet under Thomas Graves to support Cornwallis and attempt to gain dominance of the coast. On September 5th, the French fleet defeated Graves, giving France complete control of the waters around Yorktown and cutting off Cornwallis's supply lines. Despite repeated urgings from his subordinates, Cornwallis made no attempt to relieve or engage the Franco-Americans before they established siege lines, still hoping that reinforcements would arrive from New York. The Franco-American army besieged Yorktown on September 28th. Cornwallis ordered the abandonment of the outer redoubts, which the Americans soon occupied, an action that hastened Cornwallis's subsequent defeat. The British failed in their attempt to break out across the river at the Gloucester Fortress due to a storm. The Union bombardment was becoming increasingly intense, and the British forces were exhausted. Cornwallis accepted that the situation was untenable and negotiated a surrender on October 17, 1781, with the loss of 7,685 men. On the same day, 6,000 troops under Clinton left New York, sailing to relieve Yorktown. The final years of the war, 1781-1783, main articles: Anglo-French War, 1778-1783, Spain and the American Revolutionary War, Second Anglo-Mysore War, and Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, defeat of the floating batteries at Gibraltar, December 13, 1782, by John Singleton Copley. Europe. After hostilities with the Dutch began in late 1780, Britain quickly deployed troops, enforcing a blockade of the North Sea. Within weeks, the British had captured 200 Dutch merchants, and a further 300 had taken refuge in foreign ports, although political instability within the Republic and peace negotiations on both sides helped to reduce the conflict. The majority of the Dutch public supported a military alliance with France against Britain. However, the Dutch stadtholder disapproved of this idea, hoping to secure an early peace. To revive the depressed trade, a Dutch squadron under Johann Zoutman escorted a fleet of 70 merchants from Texel. Zoutman's ships were intercepted by Sir Hyde Parker, and the Battle of Zoutman broke out at Doggerbank on 5 August 1781. Although the engagement was tactically inconclusive, the Dutch fleet did not dare leave port again during the war, and their merchant fleet was completely crippled. On the 6th of January 1781, a French attempt to capture Jersey to capture British privateers failed. Tired of the defeat at Gibraltar, a Franco-Spanish force of 14,000 men under the Duc de Man invaded Minorca on 19 August. After a siege of St. Eusters, Philip, the British garrison under James Murray, surrendered on 5 February 1782, securing the Spanish's main political objective. At Gibraltar, a major Franco-Spanish attack on 13 September 1782 was repulsed with heavy losses. On 20 October 1782, after successfully supplying Gibraltar, British ships commanded by Richard Howe defeated Luis de Cordova's Franco-Spanish fleet, ending Cordova's dominance of the seas. On 7 February 1783, after 1,022 days of siege, the Franco-Spanish army withdrew, a decisive defeat. America's Spanish troops, led by Bernardo de Galvez at the Battle of Pensacola. Oil on canvas, Augusto Ferrer Dalmau, 2015 Saint Eustatius, a key supply port for the Patriots, was sacked by British forces under George Rodney on 3 February 1781, who plundered the island's wealth. Few campaigns were waged against the Dutch. However, several Dutch colonies were captured by the British in 1781. After the fall of the British fort at Mobile at the hands of Bernardo de Galvez's Spanish army, an attempt to capture Pensacola was hampered by a storm. Inspired by the Spanish defeat, John Campbell, the British commander at Pensacola, decided to retake Mobile. Campbell's expeditionary force of about 700 men was defeated on January 7, 1781. After consolidating at Havana, Galvez sailed for Pensacola on February 13th. Arriving on March 9th, siege operations did not begin until March 24th, due to the difficulty of getting large ships into the bay. After a siege lasting 45 days, Galvez drove out the British garrison, setting the stage for the conquest of West Florida. In May, Spanish forces captured the Bahamas, although the British recaptured the islands bloodlessly the following year on 18th April. In the West Indies, on 29th April 1781, a Royal Navy squadron under Samuel Hood was narrowly defeated by the French, led by the Comte de Grasse, who went on to seize British territories. Tobago fell to the French on 2nd June. The Demerara and Essequibo territories fell on 26 January 1782. St. Kitts and Nevis on 12th of February. A British naval victory on 25th of January had no significant impact, and Montserrat on 22nd of February. Battle of Dominica, 12th of April 1782. Admiral George Rodney defeats Comte de Grasse in the West Indies. Oil on Canvas. By Thomas Whitcomb in 1782, the main strategic objective of France and Spain was to capture Jamaica, where sugar exports were worth more to the British than the combined production of the 13 colonies. One on Spain. On 7 April of 1782, de Grasse left Martinique to join the Franco-Spanish army at San Sebastián and invade Jamaica from the north. The British, led by Hood and George Rodney, pursued and drove the French from Dominica between 9 and 12 April. The Spanish plan to conquer Jamaica was ruined, and the balance of naval power in the Caribbean now favored the Royal Navy. In Guatemala, Matias de Galvez led Spanish troops in an attempt to dislodge British settlements along the Bay of Honduras. Galvez captured Roatan on 16th of March 1782 and then quickly took the Black River. After a decisive naval victory at Sant, Archibald Campbell, the royal governor of Jamaica, commissioned Edward Despard to retake the Black River, which he succeeded in doing on 22nd August. However, with peace negotiations opened and Franco-Spanish resources focused on the siege of Gibraltar, no further military action took place there. India. After the Netherlands entered the conflict, Hector Munro's East India Company army captured the Dutch port of Negapatam after a 3-week siege on 11 October 1781. Shortly thereafter, British Admiral Edward Hughes captured Trincomalee after a brief engagement on 11 January 1782. In March 1781, French Admiral Bailly de Suffren was sent to India to support the colonial front. Suffren reached the Indian coast in February 1782, where he encountered a British fleet under Hughes, winning a narrow tactical victory. After landing at Porto Novo to support the Mysore rebels, Suffren's fleet clashed with Hughes again at Providia on 12th April. The outcome was inconclusive, although Hughes' fleet was worse off than before, and he was forced to retreat to the British-held port of Trincomalee. Hyder Ali wanted the French to capture Negapatam to establish naval dominance, and this task was Suffren's responsibility. Suffren's fleet clashed with Hughes again off Negapatam on 6 July. Suffren retreated to Cuddalore, strategically defeated, and the British retained control of Negapatam. Intending to find a more suitable port than Cuddalore, Suffren took Trincomalee on 4th September and defeated Hughes 2 days later. The British, Wright and French, left fleets, with Admiral Suffren's flagship Cléopâtre far left, duel at Cuddalore by Auguste Jugelet, 1836. Meanwhile, Ali's army loosely blockaded Vellore while the East India Company was regrouping. Company troops under Sir Eyre Coote led a counterattack, defeating Ali at Porto Novo on 1st July 1781, Pollilure on 27th August, and Sholinghur on 27th September, driving the Mysore army from the Carnatic. On 18th of February 1782, Tipu Sultan defeated John Braithwaite near Tanjore, taking all 1,800 of his men prisoner. The war by this point had reached a stalemate. On 7th of December 1782, Hyder Ali died, and the rule of Mysore passed to his son, Tipu Sultan. The Sultan advanced along the west coast, besieging Mangalore on 20th of May 1783. Meanwhile, on the east coast, an army under James Stewart laid siege to the French-held port of Cuddalore on 9th June 1783. On 20th of June, British naval support for the Quai siege was nullified when Suffren defeated Hughes' fleet and drove them out of Cuddalore. And although the victory was narrow, It gave Suffren the opportunity to take over British territories in India. On 25 June, the Franco-Mysorean defenders made several attacks against the British lines, although all failed. On 30th June, news of a preliminary peace between the belligerent powers spread, and the siege ended when the French abandoned the siege. Mangalore remained under siege and surrendered to the king on 30th January 1784. Minor clashes followed, but Mysore and Britain made peace on 11 March. Military analysis: British Empire redcoats fighting at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. The population of Great Britain and Ireland in 1780 was about 6 million, while the 13 colonies had a population of about 2.8 million, including about 500,000 slaves. In theory, Britain had the advantage, however. Many factors prevented it from maintaining a large army. Armed Forces Recruit in 1775. The British Standing Army, excluding the militia, numbered 45,123 men worldwide, including 30 account 254 infantry and 6,869 cavalry. The Army had about 18 infantry regiments, some 8,500 men stationed in North America. The Standing Army had played a major role in the purge of the Long Parliament in 1648, maintaining the military dictatorship under Oliver Cromwell, and overthrowing King James II of England. And as such, the British Army was kept small in peacetime to prevent abuses of royal power. However, the 18th century army was no guest and was despised by the press and public of both the New and Old Worlds as enemies of liberty. A famous maxim in the Navy: a troublemaker before a shipmate before a stranger before a dog before a soldier. Conscription, British cartoon from 1780 Parliament, had difficulty recruiting enough men and found it impossible to meet the quotas they had set. The Army was a very unpopular profession, and a constant problem was pay. A private infantryman was paid a mere 8 pence a day, the same as a new model infantryman 130 years earlier. Pay rates in the Army were inadequate to meet the rising cost of living, and potential recruits were scarce, and military service was nominally for life. To entice more people to sign up, Parliament offered a bounty of 10 per recruit. As the Majovita War dragged on, Parliament became desperate for manpower. Criminals were allowed to serve to escape legal punishment, and deserters were pardoned if they rejoined their units. After the defeat at Saratoga, Parliament doubled the bounty to 3 and increased it again the following year to 30, as well as extending the age limit from 1745 to 1650 years. Conscription was a popular, though unpopular, method of recruitment, with men enlisting in local militias to avoid military service. Attempts were made to conscript these men, with militia commanders standing by and watching. Competition between naval and army conscription schemes, even between fleets or regiments, often led to quarrels or violence to secure recruits for their units. Men often crippled themselves to avoid conscription, while many deserted on the first day. Conscripts were militarily unreliable. Regiments with large numbers of such men were deployed to garrisons such as Gibraltar or the West Indies to reduce the frequency of successful desertions. By 1781, the Army had approximately 121,000 enlisted, men worldwide, 48,000 of whom were stationed across the Americas. Of the 171,000 sailors, Galkate, who had served in the Royal Navy during the conflict, about a quarter had been conscripted. A similar proportion, some 42,000, had deserted during the war. At its peak, the Navy had 94 ships of the line, 104 frigates, and 37 light warships in service. Loyalists and Hessians. Hessian soldier in 1775. Britain failed to secure 20,000 mercenaries from Russia and the Scots Brigade from the Dutch Republic, and was left short of manpower. Parliament managed to negotiate and offer treaties to the princes of several German states for large sums of money in exchange for troops. In total, 2,975 soldiers were hired to serve in the British Army from 6 German states: Brunswick, 5,723 men; Hesse-Kassel, 16,992 men; Hesse-Hanau, 2,222 men; Ansbach-Bayreuth, 2,353 men; Waldeck-Pyrmont, 1,225 men; and Anhalt-Zerbst, 1,160 men. King George III, who ruled Hanover as Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, was asked by Parliament to lend the government troops for war service. Hanover provided 2,365 soldiers divided into 5 battalions. However, the agreement only allowed them to use Hanoverian soldiers in Europe. Without any major allies, the shortage of troops became extremely serious when France and Spain entered the war, forcing Britain to divert much of its military resources from the Americas to other fronts. Recruiting sufficient numbers of loyalist militiamen in America was difficult due to the high Patriot resistance. To bolster their numbers, the British promised freedom and land to slaves who fought for them. Some 25,000 loyalists fought for the British throughout the war and provided the bulk of the British Army's best soldiers. The British Legion, a mixed regiment of 250 dragoons and 200 infantry, commanded by Banastre Tarleton, was notorious in the colonies for its effectiveness, especially in the South. Logistics Grenadier of the 40th Infantry Regiment in 1767, armed with Brown Bess muskets. The logistical organization of 18th century armies was chaotic, and the British Army was no exception. There was no quartering corps in the modern sense. In overseas campaigns such as those in America, horses, carriages, and grooms were often requisitioned from the local population, often by force or hire. There was no medical corps. Surgeons without formal medical education, diplomas, or entrance examinations were usually recruited directly into the medical service. Nurses were often apprentices, many women recruited from the local population. Military surgeons and physicians were often poorly paid and had a lower social status than other officers. The heavy personal equipment and woolen uniforms of the infantry were completely unsuited to combat in America, which made it difficult for soldiers to move quickly. At the Battle of Monmouth in late June 1778, temperatures exceeded 37.8 degrees, 100 degrums, and the heat stroke is said to have claimed more lives than combat. The standard musket of the British Army was the Brown Bess. Most Army officers preferred their men to fire carefully by calculation, about twice per minute, rather than at a rapid rate. The bayonet made firing inconvenient, as its bulky shape prevented the firing mechanism from striking the barrel. The British Army tended to fire wildly, resulting in inaccurate shots, a trait for which John Burgoyne criticized them during the Saratoga campaign. Burgoyne instead encouraged troops to charge with bayonets to break through enemy formations, a tactic quite common in most European armies at the time. Soldiers of the Black Watch armed with Brown Bess guns. In 1790, every American battalion had its own rifle company by the end of the war, although rifles were not officially issued to the Army until the Baker rifle was produced in 1801. 516. Flintlocks were highly dependent on the weather. Strong winds could blow gunpowder from the priming cup, while heavy rain could wet paper bullets, ruining the gunpowder and rendering the gun unfireable. Furthermore, the flints used in British muskets were of poor quality. They could only be fired about 6 times before needing to be recut, while American flints could be fired about 60 times. A British saying was, "Yankee flint is as good as a glass of wine." Feeding the troops and sailors was a difficult challenge, as much of the food had to be shipped from Britain. Maintaining loyalist support made it difficult for the Army to rely on them for food supplies. Other factors also hampered this option. The American countryside was sparsely populated and largely hostile or unaffiliated. The road and bridge networks were poorly developed, and the area under British control was so limited that foraging parties were often at risk of ambush. After France entered the war, the threat of the French Navy increased the difficulty of transporting supplies to America. Food supplies were often in short supply. The climate also worked against the British in the southern colonies and the Caribbean, where the intense summer heat caused food to sour and spoil. Life at sea was somewhat better. Sailors and passengers were given a daily food ration, which consisted largely of hardtack biscuits and beer. Hardtack was often infested with worms and was so hard that it was nicknamed Jaw Crusher and Worm Castle, and sailors sometimes had to break it with cannonballs. Meat supplies often spoiled on long voyages. A shortage of fresh fruit and vegetables led to scurvy, one of the most notorious killers at sea. Commander Britton found it difficult to appoint a skilled senior military leader in America. Thomas Gage, Commander-in-Chief of the North American Theater in the early years of the war, was criticized for being too lenient towards traitors. Jeffrey Amherst, who was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army in 1778, refused to follow a direct order in America due to his unwillingness to choose sides in the war. Admiral Augustus Keppel similarly objected to an order, stating, "I cannot draw my sword for such a cause." The Earl of Effingham resigned from his commission when his regiment was sent to America, and Generals William Howe and John Burgoyne both opposed military solutions to the crisis. Both Howe and Henry Clinton claimed that they had been reluctant and had only followed orders. As was the case with many European armies at the time, with the exception of the Prussian army, officers serving in the British Army could purchase commissions to rise through the ranks. Although Parliament repeatedly opposed this ironic law, bribery for promotion remained common in the Army. The value of a commission varied, but often corresponded to social and military prestige, with regiments such as the Guards commanding the highest prices. Lower ranks often regarded the high commissions of wealthy officers as plums for their consumption. Wealthy individuals with no military training or lacking practical experience often found their way into high positions, reducing the effectiveness of a regiment. Although the sale of warrants had been banned by the royal government since 1711, it was still permitted for children to purchase warrants. Boys, often orphans of wealthy dead officers, were taken off school and placed in high positions in regiments. Discipline in the armed forces was harsh, and flogging was used to punish even the most trivial offenses. For example, 2 redcoats received 1,000 lashes each for looting during the Saratoga campaign, while another received 800 lashes for assaulting a superior officer. Flogging was a common punishment in the Royal Navy and was associated with the stereotypical toughness of the sailor. Despite the iron discipline of the Army, a lack of self-discipline pervaded the British troops. The soldiers had a passion for gambling, to the point where soldiers often bet their own uniforms. Drunkenness was common, and this was not only common among privates. William Howe reported seeing many crappy mornings while stationed in New York. General John Burgoyne drank heavily every evening until the end of the Saratoga campaign. 2 generals were also reported to have found solace in the wives of junior officers as a distraction from the burden of command. During the Philadelphia campaign, British officers deeply offended local Quakers by entertaining their mistresses in the houses where they had stayed. Some reports indicate that the British Army was generally cautious in its treatment of civilians. This is in contrast to the diaries of Hessian soldiers who recorded the disrespect in the British soldiers' behavior towards the local people, such as destroying property and executing prisoners. Ineffective strategy. The British leadership soon discovered that they had overestimated their military capabilities and underestimated the rebels, forcing them to reconsider their military plans. The inaction of British military and civilian officials in dealing with the initial rebellions allowed the colonists to gain the upper hand, causing the British government to quickly lose control. Of all the colonies, a prime example of this was the Battle of Bunker Hill. It took 10 hours for British commanders to react after seeing the Americans on the Charlestown Peninsula. giving them enough time to consolidate their defenses. Instead of opting for a swift and highly effective flanking thrust with minimal casualties, the British decided to attack head-on multiple times. The results were clear. The British suffered 1,054 casualties from an initial force of about 3,000 men after multiple frontal attacks. However, British leaders remained overly optimistic, believing that only 2 regiments would be needed to suppress the uprising. In Massachusetts, debate persists over whether British defeat was inevitable. Fleming argues that the chances of an American victory were slim and that British defeat was a miracle. Ellis, however, argues that the odds were always in America's favor and questions whether British victory was realistically possible. Ellis argues that the British missed their only chance for decisive victory in 1777 and that William Howe's strategies underestimated the obstacles the Americans posed. Ellis concludes that once Howe failed, the chance for a British victory would never return. In contrast, the official U.S. Army textbook argues that had Britain been able to bring 10,000 fresh troops to the battle in 1780, British victory would have been possible. William Howe historians such as Ellis and Stewart have observed that under William Howe, the British missed several opportunities to win decisive victories over the Americans. During the campaigns in New York and Philadelphia, Howe made several strategic errors that hindered their success. At Long Island, Howe did not even attempt to lay siege to Washington, and instead ordered his subordinates to pursue the defeated Americans. At White Plains, he did not engage Washington's outnumbered army, and instead concentrated his resources on a non-strategic hill. After taking New York, Howe sent Henry Clinton to attack Newport, a plan Clinton opposed on the grounds that the troops assigned to him could be better used to pursue Washington's retreating Americans. Despite the dire prospects for the revolutionary cause and the increase in Loyalist activity following Washington's defeat, Howe did not attempt to attack Washington while the Americans settled into winter quarters. Meaning, after the Revolution, the United States became the first American country to drive out European colonialism, setting an example for later independent countries. Since the outbreak of the American Revolution, American envoys in the Prussian capital had petitioned King Frederick II the Great to recognize their independence, and then, after the British defeat, the king signed the American-Prussian Treaty of Amity in 1785. This was the first commercial agreement between the two countries.